Welcome to Listening History Sleepy. Tonight we journey to Sparta not to celebrate its glory uncritically, but to walk among the contradictions, to feel the weight of a civilization that chose hardship when others chose comfort, that valued death over dishonor, that created warriors unmatched in Greece while creating almost nothing else. This is not a story of triumph alone. This is an examination of what happens when a society focuses so absolutely on a single goal, military excellence, that everything else withers. When we speak of Sparta, we speak of a phantom city, a place that exists more powerfully in legend than it ever did in reality, ruled by laws attributed to a man like Lycurgus whose very existence remains uncertain. The Spartans themselves could not agree on when Lycurgus lived. Some ancient sources placed him in the 9th century BCE, making him near contemporary of Homer. Others dated him to the 7th or 6th centuries, hundreds of years later. Some said he was uncle of a Spartan king, served as regent, then gave laws and departed, wandering to Delphi or Crete or Egypt, eventually starving himself to death to prevent the laws from being changed. Others said he was descended from Heracles, was divinely inspired, brought laws directly from Apollo at Delphi. The accounts contradict, blur into myth, make it impossible to separate man from legend if there was a man at all. What we know is that by the classical period 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Sparta was different, profoundly different. While Athens developed democracy and philosophy and drama, Sparta remained oligarchy governed by 2 hereditary kings, a council of elders, and 5 ephors elected annually. While Athenians pursued wealth and built the Parthenon, Spartans lived austerely in simple houses and ate communal meals of black broth so unpalatable that a visiting dignitary allegedly remarked he now understood why Spartans did not fear death. While other Greeks educated their children in rhetoric and philosophy, Spartans subjected boys to the agoge, brutal training system that began at age 7 and lasted until age 20, that deliberately starved them and beat them and forced them to endure pain without complaint. The system worked in its narrow way. Sparta produced the finest heavy infantry in Greece, hoplites who fought in phalanx formation with discipline unmatched elsewhere, who held the pass at Thermopylae against impossible odds, who terrified enemies by their reputation alone. But the system also produced a society with almost no literature, no philosophy that influenced later thought, no art comparable to other Greek cities, no cultural achievements that endure beyond the military reputation. Sparta sacrificed everything: individual freedom, intellectual development, artistic expression, even basic human comfort to create warriors. And for a time, the sacrifice seemed justified. Sparta dominated the Peloponnese, led the Greek alliance that defeated Persia, eventually defeated Athens in the long Peloponnesian War, but victory was hollow. Sparta could conquer but could not govern, could defeat enemies but could not create lasting peace, could produce warriors but could not produce the administrators and diplomats and philosophers needed to manage an empire. Within a generation of defeating Athens, Sparta's power was waning. By the time Thebes shattered the Spartan army at Leuctra in 371 BCE, killing 400 Spartans in a single battle, a catastrophic loss for a population already depleted, Sparta's decline was irreversible. The system that had produced invincibility produced also inflexibility. The warriors who would not retreat could not adapt. The society that had perfected one form of warfare could not counter innovation. The city that had sacrificed everything to military excellence discovered that military excellence alone was insufficient. What remains is ruins, scattered stones where Sparta stood, far less impressive than Athenian remains and legends. The legend of Leonidas and the 300, the legend of Spartan discipline and courage, the legend of mothers telling sons to return with their shields or upon them. The legend of the lawgiver who gave laws and then disappeared, leaving Sparta bound by customs that could not be written, could not be changed, could only be obeyed or rejected. These legends are powerful, have inspired military traditions across centuries, continue shaping how we think about courage and sacrifice and duty, but legends simplify. They extract what seems admirable, the courage at Thermopylae, while ignoring context, the brutal agoge that created that courage, the helot slavery that made the military system possible, the rigid inflexibility that prevented adaptation. The legends inspire but also deceive, make Sparta seem more admirable than it was, make its system seem worthy of emulation when in truth it was catastrophically flawed. Every fascist regime since has invoked Sparta to justify authoritarianism. Every militaristic society has compared itself to Sparta. Every argument for sacrificing freedom to security, for valuing order over justice, for subordinating individual to collective, all invoke Sparta as model. This is why we must examine Sparta carefully, must honor what deserves honoring while rejecting what deserves rejection, must understand both achievements and costs. And tonight we walk among Sparta's contradictions, the egalitarianism that rested on slavery, the freedom that required unfreedom, the military excellence that produced cultural poverty, the discipline that created courage and crushed humanity, the laws attributed to a phantom lawgiver who may never have existed but whose legacy shaped centuries. We will not conclude with simple judgments, will not declare Sparta wholly good or wholly bad. We'll acknowledge the complexity, will sit with the discomfort of a civilization that achieved much and lost more, that created warriors capable of Thermopylae and a system incapable of producing anything beyond warriors. We will learn from Sparta what to emulate and what to avoid, what to honor and what to reject, what happened when humans pursued single goal with absolute focus and discovered the goal was insufficient. The night is long. The journey begins now. Let us enter the city carved from stone, the society shaped by laws that could not be written, the civilization that exists more powerfully in memory than it ever did in reality. Let us meet the phantom lawgiver and the boys who became warriors, the women who owned land and the helots who made everything possible, the fighters who held Thermopylae and the society that could not survive its own success. Sparta waits silent ruins and loud legends, scattered stones and persistent myths, vanished civilization and enduring warnings. Let us learn what it has to teach. Let us walk carefully among the contradictions. Let us remember that history is not simple, that civilizations are not purely good or evil, that even Sparta, harsh Sparta, brutal Sparta, admirable Sparta deserves to be understood in its complexity rather than reduced to legend or caricature. The phantom city beckons. The lawgiver who may never have existed calls across centuries. The warriors who died at Thermopylae wait to tell their story. The helots who suffered in silence deserve to be remembered. The system that succeeded and failed, that achieved and destroyed, that created Thermopylae and created the Cryptea, this system demands our attention, our understanding, our careful judgment. Come, night deepens. The journey into Sparta's heart begins. The phantom lawgiver waits. The city carved from stone stands silent but speaks still. Let us listen to what it says: the glory and the horror, the achievement and the cost, the courage and the cruelty. Let us learn from Sparta, let us understand it, let us emerge wiser for having walked among its ruins and wrestled with its contradictions. The night is long, the lessons are many. Sparta teaches still if we will listen, if we will learn, if we will honor truth over legend, complexity over simplification, understanding over judgment. The phantom lawgiver gave Sparta laws. Let us learn what those laws created. Let us understand what they cost. Let us judge whether the price was worth paying. Now, let the journey begin. Sparta waits in darkness. Let us bring light, not the light that blinds, but the light that illuminates, that reveals both beauty and ugliness, that makes visible what the legends hide and the ruins testify. The phantom lawgiver, the city carved from stone, the warriors who would not retreat, the system that could not adapt, all waiting, all teaching, all asking whether we can learn from their example both what they did right and what they did catastrophically wrong. Come, Sparta calls, let us answer. Sparta rises not from conquest alone but from covenant, a covenant inscribed not on tablets of stone or rolls of papyrus, but spoken into being and then forbidden to be written down. The laws exist only in practice, only in blood memory, only in the discipline passed from elder to warrior across generations that span centuries. The lawgiver who supposedly created this system was Lycurgus, a figure whose very existence scholars debate, whose historicity remains uncertain, whose reforms shaped what became the most austere civilization ancient Greece ever produced. This chapter descends into the mystery of laws that could not be written, of a society that deliberately chose hardship over comfort, of warriors trained from childhood to value death over dishonor, of women who allegedly told their departing sons to return with their shields or upon them, meaning return victorious or return dead, but never return defeated. The ancient sources cannot agree on Lycurgus. Herodotus mentions him but provides few details. Xenophon describes Spartan customs without attributing them to specific lawgiver. Plutarch, writing 600 years after Lycurgus supposedly lived, admits the accounts of the lawgiver's life are contradictory, impossible to reconcile, perhaps entirely legendary. Some sources claim Lycurgus was descended from Heracles through the Spartan royal line. that he served as regent for his infant nephew, that during his regency he traveled to Crete and observed their laws, perhaps traveled to Egypt and learned from their priests, that he brought back to Sparta a vision of how society should be organized. Other sources claim Lycurgus received the laws directly from Apollo at Delphi, that the Pythia proclaimed his laws divinely inspired, that their sacred origin made them unchangeable. Still other sources suggest Lycurgus was simply personification of ancient Spartan customs, that later Spartans invented the Lawgiver to give their traditions authority, that no single reformer created Spartan society, but rather it evolved through processes now lost to history. The uncertainty matters because it shapes how we understand Sparta. If Lycurgus existed and created the system deliberately, Sparta becomes evidence of what planned society can achieve. If Lycurgus is myth and Spartan customs evolved organically, Sparta becomes evidence of how cultural evolution can produce extremes. What all sources agree on is that Spartan society was different, profoundly different, deliberately different from other Greek cities. The reforms attributed to Lycurgus, whether he existed or not, whether they were decreed by single lawgiver or evolved over time, transformed Sparta into warrior state unlike anything else in Greece. The first and most fundamental reform was the redistribution of land. The territory that Sparta controlled, Laconia and later Messenia after its conquest, was divided into lots of roughly equal size, with each Spartan citizen receiving a kleros, an allotment sufficient to support his family. The lots were worked by helots, enslaved peoples conquered by Sparta, bound to the land, required to provide fixed portion of their produce to the Spartan who owned the lot. This system freed Spartan citizens from agricultural labor, gave them time to devote to military training, created the leisure necessary for the agoge system to function. But it also created absolute dependence on helot labor. Without the helots, Spartans could not eat, could not sustain their military focus, could not exist as warriors. The dependence shaped everything: the fear of helot rebellion, the brutal measures taken to prevent uprising, the conservatism that resisted change lest it disrupt the delicate balance of power. The land redistribution was supposedly accompanied by prohibition on gold and silver currency. Sparta used iron money, deliberately made valueless outside Laconia by overvaluing it domestically, making it impossible for Spartans to accumulate wealth through trade, preventing the economic inequalities that plagued other Greek cities. The communal meals, the syssitia, were another fundamental institution attributed to Lycurgus. All Spartan citizens were required to eat together in mess groups of about 15 men, each contributing specified amounts of food from their land allotments. The meals were deliberately austere, the famous black broth made of pork, blood, salt, and vinegar that visiting foreigners found repulsive. The point was not culinary excellence but equality. All ate the same food regardless of status, all contributed equally, all participated in communal life that broke down barriers between rich and poor. But the communal meals also served as control mechanism. Those who could not provide their contributions lost citizenship, became hypomaians inferiors diminished in status and excluded from full political participation. The threat of exclusion in forced conformity ensured that Spartans maintained their land allotments productively, prevented the accumulation of debts that might compromise military readiness. The agoge, the state-controlled education and training system, was perhaps the most distinctive Spartan institution. At age 7, boys were taken from their families and entered communal barracks where they would live until age 30, receiving education designed to create warriors. The training was deliberately harsh. Boys were given insufficient food to encourage stealing, were beaten if caught stealing, not because stealing was wrong but because being caught demonstrated insufficient cunning, were required to sleep on beds they made themselves from rushes broken by hand without using knives, were subjected to ritual floggings and competitive contests designed to build endurance and courage. They learned to read and write. Spartans were not illiterate, but the education focused on military skills, physical conditioning, endurance of hardship, and obedience to authority. The psychological purpose was clear: to strip away individual identity, to create soldiers who identified completely with their unit, to build warriors who would not break in battle because they had been hardened through years of controlled suffering. Modern scholarship debates how extreme the agoge actually was, whether ancient accounts exaggerated for rhetorical effect, whether Sparta's reputation for harshness exceeded the reality. But even allowing for exaggeration, the system was brutal by any standard, deliberately traumatized children to create adults capable of extraordinary violence and extraordinary endurance. The question haunts: what does it do to humans to be subjected to such treatment from age 7? What psychological scars did the agoge leave? What emotional capacities were stunted by training that demanded constant stoicism and punished displays of tenderness or fear? The laws attributed to Lycurgus also governed relations between men and women in ways unusual for ancient Greece. Spartan women were trained physically not in warfare, but in athletic activities designed to produce healthy mothers capable of bearing strong children. They learned to read, participated in religious festivals, owned and managed property while their husbands lived in barracks. The relative freedom of Spartan women shocked other Greeks. Athenian writers complained that Spartan women were too independent, too outspoken, too powerful. Aristotle blamed Sparta's decline partly on women's influence, arguing that female control of property undermined male discipline. Whether his critique reflected genuine social problem or simply sexist discomfort with women's power is debatable. What's clear is that Spartan women occupied unusual position, more independent than most Greek women but still subordinated to system that valued them primarily as producers of warriors, that measured their worth by their sons' military success, that expected them to suppress maternal love in service of states' needs. The famous stories of Spartan mothers: the woman who told her son to return with his shield or upon it, the mother who killed her son when he returned defeated, the women who celebrated when told their sons died in battle, may be apocryphal, propaganda designed to emphasize Spartan harshness. But even if exaggerated, the stories reveal cultural values. That honor mattered more than life, that defeat was intolerable, that mothers should be tough rather than tender. But beneath all these specific reforms, the land redistribution, the communal meals, the agoge, the unusual status of women lay a more fundamental principle. That individual existed for the state, that personal desires and ambitions must be subordinated to collective good, that Sparta's survival required citizens to sacrifice comfort and freedom and even family bonds to maintain the military system. The principle was enforced through elaborate mechanisms of social control. The ephors who held enormous power to enforce conformity, the crypteia who terrorized helots and eliminated potential threats, the communal living that prevented privacy and made surveillance continuous, the prohibition on travel abroad that prevented Spartans from seeing alternative systems and questioning their own. The result was society of remarkable cohesion and remarkable oppression cohesion among the Spartan citizens who genuinely believed in their system, who took pride in their harshness, who thought austerity made them superior to other Greeks. Oppression of everyone else, particularly the helots who suffered under brutal system that kept them enslaved through terror. The contradictions were built into the foundation. Sparta claimed to value equality but depended on massive inequality, claimed to love freedom but denied it to most people under its control, claimed to be governed by law but made the laws unchangeable and unquestionable. The mystery of Lycurgus's absence, whether he existed and departed, whether he was myth created to explain customs whose origins were forgotten, mirrors the absence at Sparta's heart. The absence of written laws, the absence of philosophy and drama and art, the absence of evolution and adaptation, the absence of gentleness and flexibility and imagination. Sparta was defined as much by what it lacked as by what it possessed. Lacked the cultural richness of Athens, lacked the commercial vitality of Corinth, lacked the intellectual curiosity that characterized Greek civilization elsewhere. Lacked these things deliberately, consciously, as conscious choice rather than as unfortunate circumstance. The question whispers through the ruins: was the choice worth it? Did Sparta gain enough through military excellence to justify what was lost? Did the warriors produced by the agoge achieve enough to balance the suffering required to create them? Did the system's occasional triumphs, Thermopylae, victory over Athens, justify the daily oppression, the stunted lives, the narrow focus that prevented Spartans from experiencing the full range of human possibility? The answers are not simple. We can acknowledge Sparta's military achievements. They were real, were impressive, shaped Greek history. We can honor the courage of Spartan warriors. They faced impossible odds and did not break, embodied ideals of duty and sacrifice that deserve respect. But we must also acknowledge the costs: the brutalized children, the terrorized helots, the cultural poverty, the psychological damage, the rigid inflexibility that prevented adaptation when circumstances changed. We must acknowledge that the system worked only in narrow sense, produced warriors, while failing in broader sense of creating flourishing society where humans could develop their full potential. The law written in absence testifies to what happens when society becomes obsessed with single goal, when all other values are sacrificed to military excellence, when humans are reduced to instruments for states' use. The phantom lawgiver who gave these laws, whether he existed or not, created system that achieved what it attempted but attempted too little, that succeeded in narrow domain while failing comprehensively in creating conditions for human flourishing. The absence speaks louder than presence, the absent philosophy, the absent art, the absent freedom, the absent gentleness. What Sparta lacked tells us as much as what it possessed. We close standing where Sparta stood, feeling the absence, contemplating the laws that could not be written because to write them would be to make them changeable, and Sparta could not tolerate change. The phantom lawgiver who disappeared after giving laws, who allegedly blinded himself or starved himself to prevent the laws from being altered, who exists more in legend than in history, this figure embodies Sparta's fundamental character. Rigid, unchanging, defined by what it would not do as much as by what it would, powerful in narrow way but ultimately unable to adapt, to grow, to imagine alternatives. The law written in absence, the covenant spoken but not recorded. The system that could not evolve because evolution was forbidden. The phantom lawgiver whose greatest achievement was also his greatest failure, creating Sparta. At age 7, Spartan boys entered the agoge, the state-controlled education and training system that would occupy the next 13 years of their lives, that would strip away everything soft and comfortable, that would forge them into warriors or destroy those who could not endure the forging. The training was brutal by design. Insufficient food to encourage stealing and scavenging, harsh discipline to build endurance and obedience, communal sleeping in barracks to eliminate privacy and build unit cohesion, physical contests and ritualized violence to prepare for warfare's reality. The boys learned to read and write. Spartans valued literacy for military communication and record-keeping, but the education focused overwhelmingly on martial skills, physical conditioning, endurance of pain and hardship, and absolute obedience to authority. The agoge began with severance from family. At 7, boys left their mothers' houses and entered communal barracks where they would sleep, eat, and train together under supervision of older youths and adult instructors called paidinomos. The separation was deliberate psychological intervention to create warriors loyal to unit rather than to family, to break attachments that might compromise military effectiveness, to ensure that primary identity was as Spartan soldier rather than as individual with private loyalties. Modern psychology recognizes that removing children from their families at age 7 constitutes trauma, disrupts attachment bonds, creates anxiety and insecurity, establishes patterns of emotional suppression that persist into adulthood. The Spartans knew this, designed the system deliberately to create specific psychological effects: emotional hardness, capacity to endure suffering without complaint, absolute identification with military unit, willingness to die rather than retreat or surrender. The agoge was a sophisticated program of psychological conditioning, more systematic and more thorough than education systems anywhere else in ancient world. But the sophistication came at cost. The boys subjected to agoge were not simply educated, they were traumatized and reformed, shaped into instruments for state's use rather than encouraged to develop as complete human beings. The food provided in agoge was deliberately insufficient. Boys were expected to supplement their rations through stealing from fields, from the communal meals of adult citizens, from wherever they could find food without being caught. The practice served multiple purposes, taught resourcefulness and cunning essential for soldiers living off enemy territory, created artificial scarcity that encouraged aggressive competition, provided excuse for punishment that built pain tolerance and fear of failure. When boys were caught stealing, they were beaten not for stealing itself, which was encouraged, but for being caught, which demonstrated insufficient skill. The lesson was clear. Rules exist to be circumvented by the clever, failure is punishable, survival depends on outwitting systems designed to control you. The psychological message is troubling, that morality is situational, that laws apply only to those unable to break them without detection, that cleverness justifies violation of norms. The lesson served military purposes: soldiers who could live off enemy land, who would ignore restrictions when necessary, who valued success over procedural propriety. But it also created ethical framework where might made right, where success excused methods, where the strong could exploit the weak without moral constraint. The agoge's lessons about stealing extended beyond simple survival skills. They shaped how Spartans understood power, morality, and social relationships. The physical training was intense and unrelenting. Boys ran and wrestled and fought with weapons, practiced formations and maneuvers, endured ritual beatings and competitive contests designed to demonstrate courage and endurance. The most famous contest was the diamastigosis ritual whipping at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where boys competed to endure the longest without crying out, where blood flowed freely, where occasionally boys died from the beatings. Later Roman tourists watched the spectacle as entertainment, proof of Spartan toughness, but by Roman period the ritual had likely become performance rather than genuine training, sanitized version of earlier, even harsher practices. The sleeping arrangements reinforced austerity. Boys slept on beds they made themselves from rushes gathered from the Eurotas River, broken by hand without using knives. In winter, they added thistles to the rushes, believing the prickly plants generated warmth. Likely they simply made the discomfort so intense that any warmth felt welcome. The communal barracks eliminated privacy, made constant surveillance possible, created environment where deviation from norms would be immediately noticed and punished. The lack of privacy was deliberate. Spartans believed that warriors must have nothing to hide, must be transparent to their comrades, must merge individual identity into collective. But humans need privacy, need space for reflection, for vulnerability, for developing inner life separate from public performance. The agoge's elimination of privacy stunted psychological development in ways that must have damaged the men it produced, created warriors who could not be alone because they had never learned solitude, who could not reveal vulnerability because vulnerability was always punished, who could not form deep emotional bonds because emotional bonds had been systematically attacked since childhood. The system created soldiers capable of extraordinary courage in battle but incapable of ordinary human intimacy outside it. The education included music and poetry, but only of specific kinds, martial songs celebrating Spartan victories and Spartan heroes, poems praising courage and condemning cowardice, rhythms designed to coordinate military movement. The purpose was not aesthetic appreciation but military function, music as tool for maintaining morale and coordinating action. The boys learned to sing while marching, creating collective rhythm that helped maintain formation during movement. They memorized poetry that reinforced Spartan values, that taught through example what behavior was admired and what was condemned. But they did not learn to create, to question, to imagine alternative skills that might have made them better humans but would have made them worse soldiers. The older boys supervised younger ones, creating hierarchy where each level learned to dominate those below and obey those above, where authority was always present and always to be respected. The system taught both submission and command, prepared boys to follow orders unquestioningly while young and to give orders confidently when older. The hierarchy was militarily functional but psychologically damaging, taught that relationships were based on dominance and submission rather than on mutual respect, that power was to be wielded over those weaker rather than shared with equals, that obedience was primary virtue and questioning was dangerous vice. The Crypteia was the final test, the secret service where young warriors near completion of agoge training went into the countryside and hunted helots, the enslaved population that worked Sparta's fields. The Crypteia served multiple purposes. It terrorized helots into submission, eliminating potential leaders who might organize rebellion. It provided practical experience in killing before warriors faced battle. It completed the psychological conditioning by having trainees cross the ultimate boundary between training and murder. Modern scholars debate the Crypteia's nature and extent. Some sources suggest it was annual ritual where a few helots were killed. Others suggest it was extensive program of systematic terror. Still others suggest the practice was exaggerated by anti-Spartan propaganda. But even if the accounts were exaggerated, even if Crypteia was less systematic than described, its existence testifies to Sparta's willingness to use murder as educational tool, to train warriors through hunting humans, to complete military education by eliminating the distinction between training and killing. The psychological impact on the young warriors must have been profound. What does it do to human to kill defenseless person as training exercise? How does one process the deliberate murder of non-combatants as preparation for legitimate warfare? The Crypteia created warriors capable of extreme violence, valuable military asset, but also created men who had crossed moral boundaries that most societies try to maintain. The boys who survived agoge, and not all did, Some died from the beatings or the malnutrition or the violence, some were rejected as unworthy and became hypomaians or perioik, rather than full citizens emerged as hoplites ready for warfare. They were tough beyond measure, disciplined beyond comparison, capable of enduring hardships that would break men from other cities. They could march long distances carrying heavy equipment, could maintain formation under missile fire, could stand in phalanx and push against enemy shield wall without breaking, could kill without hesitation or remorse. They were the finest infantry Greece produced, proven at Thermopylae, proven in countless battles where Spartan phalanx was unbreakable, proven by the terror they inspired in enemies. But they were also damaged. The boys who became stone were hard in ways that served military purposes but that prevented human flourishing in broader sense. They could not cry, could not admit weakness, could not form the vulnerable, intimate bonds that give life richness. They had been trained to suppress emotion, to value group over self, to obey without questioning, to endure pain without complaint. They were magnificent machines for warfare, and perhaps that is all Sparta wanted them to be. But they were also humans whose full potential had been deliberately stunted, whose childhood had been stolen, whose psychological development had been warped to serve state's narrow purposes. The question haunts: was it worth it? Did the military effectiveness justify the human cost? Would these boys have chosen this path if given choice, or was the agoge simply trauma inflicted by one generation on next in perpetuation of system that served no one's genuine interests? The boys themselves could not answer, could not imagine alternatives because alternatives had been systematically eliminated from their awareness, could not question system because questioning was punished, could not rebel because rebellion meant losing the only identity and the only community they knew. We close imagining a 7-year-old boy torn from his mother's arms, entering the barracks for the first time, facing 13 years of deliberate hardship and systematic violence, becoming warrior or being destroyed in the attempt. The boy who became stone-hard, durable, useful for narrow purpose but incapable of full human experience. The agoge succeeded in its goal, created warriors who would not break in battle. But it failed in any humane sense, created men who were broken in other ways, who had survived their training but had lost something essential in surviving, who were soldiers but were not fully human. The boys who became stone, forever hard, forever shaped by trauma presented as training, forever testimony to what humans can endure and what they lose when they endure it. The agoge, the system that created Thermopylae and created the Crypteia, the training that produced warriors and destroyed children. And the victory that was also defeat, the achievement that was also loss, the success that was also failure. Spartan women lived differently than women elsewhere in ancient Greece, trained physically like men though not for warfare, educated beyond what was normal for Greek women, permitted to own property and manage estates while husbands served in the military, able to speak publicly in ways that shocked other Greeks. The explanation given by ancient sources was practical and eugenic. Sparta needed warrior mothers, needed women who could produce sons strong enough to survive the agoge and become soldiers, needed managers for estates while men lived in barracks until age 30. But the result was unusual. Women with power, with property, with public voice in society that otherwise valued total male dominance. The physical training of Spartan girls was distinctive and controversial. Like boys, girls exercised running, wrestling, throwing javelins and discuses, though separately from males and not as preparation for military service. The purpose was reproductive. Spartans believed that strong mothers would produce strong children, that physical fitness enhanced fertility and ensured healthy bodies, that women needed conditioning to survive childbirth and recover quickly to bear more children. The training was successful in narrow sense. Spartan women apparently had lower maternal mortality than women elsewhere in Greece, were healthier and lived longer, produced children who survived infancy at higher rates. But the training was also shocking to other Greeks. Athenian writers complained that Spartan girls exercised naked or nearly naked, that they competed publicly where men could see them, that their physical development made them masculine and immodest. The criticism reveals Athenian anxiety more than Spartan reality reveals that Athenian men felt threatened by strong women, disturbed by female independence, uncomfortable with women who were not confined to domestic spaces and hidden from public view. Spartan women's response to such criticism was reportedly disdainful. According to Plutarch, when asked why Spartan women were the only women who ruled their men, Gorgo, wife of King Leonidas, replied, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." The property ownership was even more controversial. Spartan women could inherit land, could own property in their own right, could manage estates independently while husbands and sons served in military. By the 4th century BCE, women allegedly controlled 2/5 of Spartan land, a statistic that shocked Aristotle, who blamed Sparta's decline partly on female influence, arguing that women's control of wealth corrupted warriors who should have maintained austere discipline. Whether Aristotle's analysis was accurate or was misogynistic rhetoric is debatable. What's clear is that Spartan women had economic power unusual in ancient world, that this power came from military system that kept men away from home for extended periods, that women's management of estates was essential to Sparta's functioning. The economic power translated into social influence. The Spartan women spoke publicly, expressed opinions on politics and warfare, were consulted by men in ways that were unthinkable in Athens, where respectable women were secluded in separate women's quarters and rarely appeared in public. The famous Spartan women sayings collected by Plutarch, whether authentic or later inventions, show women who were sharp-tongued, confident, proud of Spartan traditions, contemptuous of weakness or cowardice. When told that her son had died fighting bravely, a Spartan mother supposedly replied, "I bore him so that he might die for Sparta." When told that her son had survived battle by hiding, a mother allegedly killed him herself for bringing shame on the family. The stories may be exaggerated or invented, propaganda designed to emphasize Spartan harshness, examples of the kind of thing Spartan women were supposed to say rather than records of what they actually said. But even as ideals rather than realities, the stories reveal cultural expectations that Spartan mothers should value sons' military success above sons' lives, that women should be hard rather than tender, that maternal love should be subordinated to states' needs. The expectation was psychologically cruel. How could mothers not love their sons? How could they celebrate deaths rather than mourn? The answer perhaps is that they could not, that beneath the public harshness was private grief, that the stories represented ideals that few could actually embody, that the famous Spartan austerity was performance as much as reality. But whether performed or genuine, the harshness shaped Spartan women's lives. They raised sons knowing the boys would be taken at age 7, would enter agoge where many would not survive, would become warriors likely to die young in battle. They raised daughters knowing the girls would face the same expectations, would be expected to produce warrior sons, would be required to suppress maternal love in service of Spartan system. The psychological burden must have been immense, to love children while knowing they belonged to state rather than to family, to nurture sons who would be taken and transformed into soldiers, to mourn deaths while pretending to celebrate them. The famous story of Gorgo and the secret message illustrates Spartan women's intelligence and importance. When Demaratus, exiled Spartan king, sent warning to Sparta that Persia was preparing to invade, he wrote the message on wooden tablets, then covered them with wax so they appeared blank. The Spartans could not understand why blank tablets had been sent until Gorgo suggested scraping off the wax to reveal the hidden message. The story, whether historical or legendary, positions Spartan woman as figure whose cleverness saved Sparta, whose insight exceeded men's, who deserved recognition for intellectual contribution to state's survival. The story contradicts the image of Sparta as purely militaristic and anti-intellectual, suggests that Spartan women at least were valued for minds as well as for bodies. But the story also reveals limits of women's power. Gorgo could advise but could not command, could suggest but could not decide, could contribute but could not rule. Spartan women had more power than most Greek women but were still subordinated to male authority, still valued primarily for reproductive function, still expected to support military system rather than to question it. The power they possessed was real but was also constrained, operating within system that fundamentally defined women through relationship to male warriors as mothers who produced them, wives who supported them, daughters who would reproduce the pattern. Aristotle's critique of Spartan women raises interesting questions about the relationship between women's power and social stability. He argued that women's control of wealth undermined Spartan discipline, that luxurious women corrupted austere men, that female influence contributed to Sparta's decline. The argument reflects Aristotelian belief that women were naturally inferior to men, that female influence in public sphere was corrupting, that proper gender hierarchy was essential to political order. But the argument might also contain kernel of accuracy. Perhaps as some Spartan women accumulated wealth, they did pressure husbands and sons to pursue economic rather than purely military goals, did encourage modifications to the austere system, did contribute to social change that eventually undermined Sparta's distinctive character. The transformation of Sparta from warrior state to more normal Greek city in Hellenistic period saw changes in women's status. They became more secluded, lost some economic power, became more like women elsewhere in Greece. Whether this represented progress or decline depends on perspective. Women lost distinctive power Spartan system gave them, but they also escaped system's peculiar burdens, no longer had to raise sons for agoge or celebrate sons' deaths. The ambiguity reflects deeper ambiguity about Spartan women's position. They had unusual power, but power came with unusual costs. They could own property but existed to serve military state. They could speak publicly but were expected to advocate for Spartan values rather than to question them. We close contemplating the contradictions of Spartan women's lives. More powerful than most Greek women yet still constrained, more independent yet still subordinated, more educated yet still valued primarily for reproduction, more public yet still expected to conform to narrow gender role. The women who owned the land also bore the burdens of Sparta's choices, raised children they did not fully possess, managed estates for warriors who lived elsewhere, maintained system that gave them unusual power but denied them usual affections. The contradiction defines them, exceptional by ancient standards yet limited by modern ones, powerful within constraints yet constrained despite power, beneficiaries of system that privileged them above women elsewhere yet victims of system that denied them full humanity. The Spartan women strong, independent, sharp-tongued, property-owning, publicly influential testify to what women could achieve in ancient world when necessity demanded it. But they also testify to what women lost when achievement came at cost of maternal love subordinated to state's needs, when power came with expectation of hardness, when independence came within framework of military system that valued women ultimately as producers of warriors. The women who owned the land, forever exceptional, forever constrained, forever testimony to both women's capability and the limits society imposed even on capable women. Beneath Sparta's military machine, beneath the warrior training and the austere discipline, and the egalitarian rhetoric about Spartan citizens as equals was massive enslaved population that made everything else possible. The Helots were conquered peoples, primarily from Messenia in western Peloponnese, bound to land they had once owned, forced to provide food and labor that sustained Spartan warriors who did not farm or work but devoted themselves entirely to military training. The Helots outnumbered Spartans dramatically, perhaps 7-1, perhaps 10-1. Ancient sources disagree, but all emphasize that Helots vastly outnumbered the warrior elite that controlled them. The numerical imbalance created constant fear. Spartans lived with anxiety that Helot majority would revolt, would overwhelm warrior minority if discipline slipped or if Spartans' military power wavered even briefly. The fear shaped everything. The brutal crypteia that hunted Helots to maintain terror and eliminate potential leaders, the communal meals and barracks living that kept Spartan warriors together and ready to respond to rebellion, the prohibition on Spartans traveling abroad lest they see other systems and question whether Helot slavery was necessary or justifiable, the extreme conservatism that resisted all change because change might weaken the control keeping Helots subjugated. Each year, the ephors, the 5 annually elected magistrates who held enormous power in Sparta, formally declared war on the Helots. The declaration served multiple purposes. It made killing Helots legal, allowing Crypteia warriors to hunt them without committing murder. It reminded Helots constantly of their status as enemies rather than as fellow residents. It kept Spartans in permanent state of wartime alertness, maintained the psychological stance of readiness for conflict that military system required. The annual war declaration was one of Sparta's most revealing institutions, revealed that Spartan system was built on violence, that it required constant terror to maintain, that the peace Spartans enjoyed was possible only because of war they waged continuously against the enslaved majority. The Helots' lives were harsh beyond imagination. They worked land that had been theirs or their ancestors', surrendered half their produce to Spartan masters who contributed nothing to its production, endured humiliation and violence as routine aspects of existence. Ancient sources describe deliberate policies of degradation. Helots were forced to wear dogskin caps to mark their inferior status, were made to drink heavily and then displayed drunk to Spartan boys as examples of what to avoid, were beaten periodically to remind them of their subordination. Plutarch claims that Helots were forced to sing obscene songs and perform degrading dances, forbidden to learn noble songs or to engage in activities appropriate to free men. But Helots also maintained their own communities, their own family structures, their own memories of independence before conquest. They must have told their children stories of when their ancestors were free, must have preserved history and identity despite Spartan attempts to reduce them to instruments of labor. The persistence of Helot identity across generations, testified by their willingness to revolt when opportunity arose, demonstrates that Spartan control was never complete, that Helots maintained inner resistance even when outward submission was forced, that human dignity persists even under brutal oppression. The great Helot revolts demonstrated both Helot's courage and Sparta's vulnerability. The most famous came after the earthquake of 464 BCE, which destroyed much of Sparta and killed many Spartans. The Helots in Messenia, recognizing that Sparta was weakened, launched major rebellion that lasted years before being crushed. The revolt required Sparta to request help from other Greek cities, humiliating admission that Spartans could not control their own enslaved population without external assistance. Athens sent aid, though the Spartan request was arguably motivated more by fear of Helot's success inspiring other enslaved populations than by genuine inability to suppress the revolt. The Athenian force was dismissed before the revolt was fully crushed, reportedly because Spartans feared Athenian influence might inspire democratic sympathies in Sparta, revealing that Spartans feared ideological contamination as much as military threat. The Helots who participated in the revolt faced savage reprisals. Thucydides reports that after one revolt was crushed, 2,000 Helots who had fought most bravely and had been promised freedom were instead murdered, disappeared in ways that even Thucydides could not discover. The mass murder was deliberate terrorism, warning to other Helots that resistance was futile and that promises from Spartans were worthless. The betrayal reveals the depths of Spartan cruelty. To promise freedom as reward for service, then to murder those who trusted the promise, demonstrates that Spartans valued Helot control over any principle of honor or any commitment to keeping one's word. But some Helots did achieve freedom or semi-freedom through military service. During the Peloponnesian War, desperate for manpower, Sparta freed some Helots who served as soldiers, creating class called neodamodes, new citizens, though they never achieved full equality with Spartiates. During the war's final phases, Sparta promised freedom to any Helot who served, created force called Brassidioi after General Brasidas who led them. These semi-free former Helots fought effectively, demonstrated that Helots were capable soldiers when given motivation to fight. But their semi-free status also revealed Sparta's limitations. Even when needing soldiers desperately, even when Helots proved their military worth, Spartans would not grant full equality, could not imagine Helots as genuine equals, maintained hierarchies that undermined the unity military effectiveness required. The Helot system created constant contradictions. Spartans fought for Greek freedom against Persian tyranny while maintaining brutal slavery at home. They proclaimed themselves champions of liberty while denying liberty to the majority under their control. They claimed that their austere discipline and egalitarian practices among citizens created superior society, while ignoring that their egalitarianism rested on massive inequality below. The contradictions were not lost on other Greeks. Athens and other cities accused Sparta of hypocrisy, pointed out that Spartan freedom required others' unfreedom, questioned whether Sparta's claims to fight for liberty had any legitimacy given Helot slavery. The Spartan responses to such criticism were revealing. They did not defend Helot slavery on principle, did not argue that Helots deserved enslavement or that slavery was just. Instead, they typically avoided the subject, deflected criticism by attacking accusers' own practices, or implicitly acknowledged that Helot slavery was necessary evil rather than positive good. The silence and evasion suggest discomfort, suggest that at least some Spartans recognized the moral problems with their system, even if they felt helpless to change it without destroying Sparta entirely. The system depended on Helot labor. Remove Helots and Spartans would have to work their own land, would have no time for military training, would cease to be Spartans in any meaningful sense. The dependence trapped Spartans in system they might have questioned but could not abandon. The liberation of Messenia after Sparta's defeat at Leuctra in 371 BCE was a devastating blow, removed the agricultural base that had sustained Spartan military system for centuries. Without Messenian helots, without half the land and labor that supported them, Spartans could not maintain their distinctive lifestyle. The warrior class shrank further, the system began final collapse, Sparta became minor power rather than hegemon. The defeat demonstrated what had been true all along, that Sparta's strength was also its fatal weakness, that dependence on helot slavery created vulnerability that enemies could exploit, that the system could not survive once the foundation was removed. We close contemplating the moral catastrophe of helot slavery. These were not foreigners captured in distant wars but neighbors conquered and enslaved, were Greeks like Spartans themselves, shared language and culture and religion, differed primarily in having lost military conflict and having been systematically subjugated. The helot system was not incidental to Sparta, was fundamental, was the foundation on which everything else rested, was the condition that made warrior culture possible. Without acknowledging helot slavery and understanding its centrality, we cannot understand Sparta. The military achievements rest on this foundation of unfreedom. The austere discipline required helot labor to sustain it. The egalitarianism among Spartans was possible only because inequality below them was so extreme. The helots who made Sparta possible, forever exploited, forever terrorized, forever essential. A forever testifying that Sparta's virtue was built on vice, that its freedom required others' slavery, that its achievements came at cost of countless humans' suffering and subordination. The system that could not exist without them and could not survive their liberation. The foundation of violence and terror on which warrior society was built, the helots, forever necessary, forever despised, forever the silent majority whose labor enabled the famous minority. And forever the truth that Sparta's admirers prefer to ignore. In August of 480 BCE, at a narrow pass between mountains and sea in central Greece, 300 Spartan warriors and their allies held the pass at Thermopylae against Persian invasion force numbering hundreds of thousands. For 3 days they fought, turning the narrows into killing ground, demonstrating that disciplined heavy infantry in defensive position could defeat vastly larger forces regardless of numbers. When betrayed by local Greek named Ephialtes who showed Persians a mountain path around the pass, King Leonidas dismissed the allied contingents and kept the 300 Spartans to fight to the last man, fulfilling the code that forbade retreat, that valued death over dishonor, that turned last stand into legend that would echo through centuries. The 300 died to the last warrior, taking thousands of Persians with them, buying time for Greek fleet to prepare at Salamis, creating story that inspired Greek resistance and became foundational myth of Western military tradition. This chapter stands at the pass where they fought hot gates, the name meant, referring to thermal springs nearby feeling the weight of their decision to stay when survival was impossible, to fight when defeat was certain, to die because retreat was unthinkable given the training that had shaped them since age 7. The strategic situation was complex. The Greek alliance, led nominally by Sparta due to its military reputation, had debated where to make stand against Persian invasion. Some argued for defending the Isthmus of Corinth, narrow neck of land connecting southern Peloponnese to rest of Greece, where Greek forces could hold strong position and protect the Peloponnesian cities. Others, particularly Athenians whose city lay north of the isthmus, argued for forward defense that would protect all Greek cities rather than just southern ones. The compromise was Thermopylae, narrow enough that small force could hold it, far enough north that it protected Athens, close enough to see that Greek fleet could support land forces. Leonidas commanded not just 300 Spartans but several thousand allies, exact numbers disputed, but certainly several thousand troops total. The 300 Spartans were all full citizens, all fathers with living sons, selected specifically so their deaths would not end family lines. The allies included Thespians and Thebans, other Peloponnesian contingents, various Greek cities contributing what they could. The total force perhaps numbered 7,000 at maximum, faced Persian force that ancient sources number impossibly at over 2 million, but that modern estimates place at perhaps 150,000 to 250,000, still overwhelming numerical advantage. The first 2 days demonstrated the effectiveness of Greek hoplite tactics in narrow terrain. The pass at Thermopylae was perhaps 50 feet wide at narrowest point, maybe wider but still far too narrow for Persian forces to deploy their full numbers. The Persians attacked in waves, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm the Greeks. Instead, they encountered phalanx formation, heavily armored warriors with long spears and large shields fighting in tight formation, presenting wall of bronze and iron that Persian light infantry could not break. The Persians came in waves and were slaughtered in waves. Their archers, devastating in open terrain, were useless here, couldn't effectively shoot Greek hoplites protected by overlapping shields, couldn't maneuver to flank because terrain didn't allow it. Herodotus describes the carnage. Persians pushed forward by commanders behind them, driven by whips to attack, dying in heaps at the pass's entrance. The Greeks rotated fresh troops to front line, allowed tired warriors to rest, maintained discipline while Persians launched attack after attack. On the second day, Persian King Xerxes reportedly sent in the Immortals his elite guard, 10,000 strong, supposedly never numbering less than 10,000 because casualties were immediately replaced and even they could not break through. The Greeks held, the pass held, the strategy worked. For 2 days, small force stopped vast army because geography and superior equipment and discipline negated numerical advantage. Then came betrayal. Ephialtes, a local Greek whose name would become synonymous with betrayal, the modern Greek word for nightmare is Ephialtes, showed Persians the Anapia Path mountain trail that went around the pass that could allow Persian forces to get behind Greek position and attack from both directions. Leonidas had posted Phocian contingent to guard the path, but when Persian forces approached at night, the Phocians withdrew to high ground rather than fighting, allowed Persians to pass. When scouts reported that Persians were flanking the Greek position, Leonidas made his decision: dismiss the allies, keep the Spartans to fight to the death. The decision has been debated for millennia. Why didn't Leonidas withdraw all forces, preserve them to fight another day? Several explanations have been offered. that Spartan law forbade retreat, that withdrawing would expose the fleet to danger, that delaying Persians for even one more day was worth the sacrifice, that Oracle had prophesied that Sparta would survive only if a king died, that Leonidas understood propaganda value of heroic stand. Perhaps all these factors played roles. Perhaps Leonidas simply could not imagine leading Spartans in retreat, not because law absolutely forbade it, but because the agoge training, the cultural conditioning, the entire Spartan system had created warriors psychologically incapable of choosing withdrawal, even when withdrawal was rational. The final day's fighting is less well documented than the first 2 days, but the outcome is clear. The Spartans and the allied contingents that remained Thespians who refused to leave, Thebans who may have been hostages forced to stay, were surrounded and killed to the last man. They fought with spears until spears broke, with swords until swords broke, with hands and teeth when weapons were gone. They fought until Persian arrows darkened the sun famously. A Spartan warrior named Dineses, told that Persian arrows would block out the sun, replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." They fought until they fell, until none remained standing, until 300 Spartans had demonstrated what Lycurgus's system created. Warriors who would not yield, who could not retreat, who chose death over dishonor. The Persians buried the Greek dead, built a wall across the pass, tried to hide the extent of their own casualties. Herodotus reports that Xerxes ordered many Persian dead buried secretly so the troops wouldn't realize how costly the victory had been. The Spartans received stone lion monument, inscription, "Stranger, tell the Lacedaemonians that we lie here, obedient to their words." The epitaph attributed to poet Simonides captured Spartan ethos perfectly, not glorifying their courage or mourning their deaths, but simply noting their obedience, their fulfillment of duty, their conformity to Spartan law. The strategic impact exceeded the military one. Thermopylae delayed Persian advance perhaps a week, gave Greek fleet time to prepare, created morale boost that sustained Greek resistance. But more important was psychological impact. Thermopylae demonstrated that Persians could be fought and killed, that their numbers didn't guarantee victory, that Greek hoplites were superior warriors even when vastly outnumbered. The stand inspired resistance across Greece, made continued fighting seem possible rather than futile, created narrative of brave Greeks defending freedom against barbarian tyranny that would shape Western self-understanding for millennia. But we must also question, was the sacrifice necessary? Could Leonidas have withdrawn the Spartans as he withdrew the allies, preserved them for later battles, denied Persia the propaganda victory of annihilating Sparta's finest? The question is perhaps unanswerable but worth asking. From tactical perspective, withdrawing would have been rational. 300 Spartans killed at Thermopylae were 300 warriors not available for later battles, including Plataea, where Spartan hoplites would play crucial role in final defeat of Persian land forces. From strategic perspective, the delay achieved was minimal, perhaps days, not enough to significantly alter the campaign's course. But from psychological perspective, from the perspective of Spartan culture and identity, retreat was impossible. The agoge had trained warriors from age 7 to value death over dishonor, had created soldiers who could not conceive of yielding, had produced men whose entire identity was built on never retreating. That to ask Leonidas to withdraw was to ask him to be other than Spartan, to violate everything his training and culture had taught him, to fail in the eyes of everyone he knew and everyone who would remember him. The question, should Leonidas have retreated, assumes a freedom of choice he may not have possessed, assumes that the agoge's conditioning could be overcome by rational calculation, that culture could be discarded when pragmatism demanded it. This is perhaps Sparta's deepest lesson, that systems of total conditioning create humans who are no longer free, who cannot choose differently even when different choice would be wiser, who are trapped by their training. The 300 at Thermopylae were not heroes making free choice to sacrifice themselves, or they were not only that. They were also victims of their own culture, prisoners of their conditioning, warriors incapable of imagining alternative to dying in place. Their courage was real, was admirable, deserves honor. But their lack of alternatives, their inability to choose retreat even when retreat was tactically sound, this limitation also deserves acknowledgement. The death that justified everything, the harsh agoge, the sacrificed childhoods, the brutal discipline, the rigid system, all proven worth it when warriors it produced held Thermopylae against impossible odds. The justification rings hollow if you were the boy who died in agoge training, if you were the helot terrorized by Crypteia, if you valued human life and human flourishing over martial glory. But the justification persists, the legend endures, Thermopylae stands as Sparta's finest moment when all the sacrifice paid off, when the warriors proved worth their cost, when death purchased immortality. We close as sunset paints the pass gold, imagining the final moments as Persian arrows fell like rain, as the 300 fell defending ground they could not hold, as Sparta's warriors demonstrated that the system worked, could create soldiers who would die rather than retreat. But we also acknowledge the cost, not just the 300 who died but the thousands of boys traumatized in agoge, the countless helots terrorized to sustain the system, the cultural richness sacrificed to military focus. A Thermopylae was Sparta's triumph and Sparta's tragedy, triumph because the warriors fought magnificently, tragedy because magnificently fighting to death was all Sparta had taught them to do. The pass, the 300, the death that created legend, the sacrifice that justified system, forever inspiring, forever troubling. A forever teaching that courage is admirable, but that system producing only courage and nothing else is deeply flawed, that military excellence is impressive, but that civilization achieving only military excellence has failed, that dying bravely is honorable, but that society training humans only to die bravely has lost sight of what makes life worth living. The Spartan citizens called themselves Spartiates, the equals. The Homoi claimed that among them there was no wealth distinction, no privilege of birth beyond the twin hereditary kingships, no inequality except merit demonstrated in battle and adherence to Spartan law. The claim was partly true, was more than rhetoric, represented genuine attempt to create egalitarian society among citizen class. The land reforms attributed to Lycurgus divided Laconian and later Messenian territory into equal lots, the cleri, with each Spartiate receiving allotment sufficient to support his family through helot labor. The communal meals the systitia required all citizens to eat together regardless of status, to contribute equally from their land's produce, to consume the same austere fare whether king or common soldier. The prohibition on gold and silver prevented wealth accumulation through trade or commerce. Sparta used iron currency, deliberately overvalued domestically and worthless outside Laconia, making it impossible to hoard wealth or to engage in the kind of commercial activities that created massive inequalities in other Greek cities. Spartans were forbidden to engage in any profession except warfare, no commerce, no crafts beyond basic necessities, no pursuit of wealth through business or trade. The austerity was enforced through social pressure and legal restrictions. Spartans who acquired wealth or luxuries faced ostracism, could be punished by ephors, risked losing status if they violated norms of equality and simplicity. The result was society where visible inequality among citizens was minimized. The Spartans dressed similarly in simple cloaks, lived in houses that were deliberately plain and uniform, ate the same food at communal meals, participated in same military training and exercises. The egalitarianism was real enough that visitors from other Greek cities remarked on it, contrasted Spartan equality with extreme wealth gaps in their own societies, sometimes expressed admiration for Sparta's success in avoiding the wealth-driven political conflicts, oligarchy versus democracy, rich versus poor, that plagued other cities. But the equality was fiction, carefully maintained appearance that concealed real inequalities. Some Spartiates were descended from royal families, held hereditary privileges, commanded in battle by right of birth rather than by demonstrated merit alone. The two kings Sparta uniquely had dual monarchy, perhaps originally from merger of two communities, held enormous prestige, led armies in war, possessed religious authority, lived in larger houses and enjoyed privileges denied to other citizens. The kings were technically subject to Spartan law, could be fined or exiled by ephors, but in practice their status gave them advantages that contradicted egalitarian rhetoric. Some Spartans were wealthier despite formal equality, controlled more productive land, had access to more helot labor, possessed connections and relationships that brought material advantages. The formal division of land into equal lots could not prevent some lots from being more productive than others, some locations being more valuable, some Spartans accumulating de facto control over multiple lots through marriage alliances or other arrangements. By 4th century BCE, wealth inequality among Spartans had increased dramatically. Aristotle reports that by his time, 2/5 of Spartan land was controlled by women through inheritance, and that massive inequality existed despite egalitarian rhetoric. The process of losing Spartiate status revealed another dimension of inequality. Citizens who could not contribute to their syssitia because crops failed, because helots rebelled or fled, because they had been wounded and could not maintain their land, lost citizenship, became hypomaians, inferiors, no longer full Spartiates but not helots either, occupying middle status that was neither enslaved nor fully free. The hypomaians could not participate in political life, could not vote in assembly, lost the military training and status that defined Spartan identity. They remained in Spartan society but as second-class members, visible reminders that equality was conditional, that economic misfortune could strip away status regardless of individual merit or valor. The demographic crisis worsened the situation. Sparta's population of full citizens declined steadily from perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 adult male Spartiates in 5th century BCE to fewer than 2,000 by mid-4th century to fewer than 1,000 by Hellenistic period. The causes were multiple. Battle casualties, particularly after the defeat at Leuctra, killed 400 in single day. Economic pressures that made some unable to maintain citizenship. Families choosing to have fewer children rather than subject them to agoge, sons dying in agoge or in warfare before producing heirs. Each death without replacement decreased the citizen population, concentrated land ownership among survivors, made the gap between wealthy Spartiates and poor Spartiates larger. The oliganthropia, shortage of men, the ancient term, became existential crisis. Fewer Spartiates meant fewer soldiers, meant military power declined, meant control over helot majority became more precarious, meant Sparta could no longer field armies that had once dominated Greece. Various reforms were attempted, granting citizenship to hypomaians who could somehow pay for restoration, freeing helots who served in military and giving them semi-citizenship as neodamodes, eventually allowing perioike free non-citizens living in Laconia to serve in Spartan army alongside Spartiates. But these expedients addressed symptoms without solving underlying problem. That Spartan system was demographically unsustainable, that attrition was inevitable, that rigid requirements for maintaining citizenship created downward spiral. The most radical reform attempts came too late. In 3rd century BCE, Kings Augustus IV and Cleomenes III tried to restore Lycurgus system by canceling debts, redistributing land, expanding citizenship to include more inhabitants. The reforms failed. Augustus was executed by ephors. Cleomenes succeeded temporarily, but was eventually defeated and fled to Egypt, but they revealed that even Spartans recognized their system was failing, that traditional egalitarianism had collapsed into oligarchy of wealthy few controlling impoverished many. The attempted reforms also revealed deep resistance to change. Those who benefited from inequality opposed reforms that would redistribute wealth, preferred to maintain privileges even if maintaining them meant Sparta's continued decline. The contradiction at Sparta's heart, the egalitarian rhetoric, depended on massive inequality. The equality among Spartans was possible only because inequality below them was so severe. Perhaps 8,000 Spartiates at peak shared roughly equal status, but they ruled over perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 helots and perioike who had no status at all. The egalitarianism was exclusive, applied only to tiny minority, required extreme stratification to sustain itself. The Spartiate who proclaimed equality with his fellow citizens did so while being supported by helot labor, while benefiting from system that denied helots any rights, while participating in system that annually declared war on enslaved majority. The internal contradiction became external hypocrisy. Sparta claimed to fight for Greek freedom against Persian tyranny, presented itself as defender of liberty against despotism, led the Greek alliance as champion of autonomy and independence. But Sparta's own system was based on denying freedom to majority under its control, on maintaining brutal slavery that was more oppressive than many forms of Persian rule. Athens and other democratic cities accused Sparta of hypocrisy, pointed out that Spartan liberation meant replacing one form of tyranny with another, questioned whether Sparta's egalitarianism among citizens justified the massive unfreedom it required to sustain that egalitarianism. The Spartans' responses to such criticism were revealing. They did not defend helot slavery as just or necessary evil with explicit philosophical arguments. Instead, they typically changed subject, attacked critics' own practices, or simply asserted that Spartan way was best without attempting to justify it rationally. The evasiveness suggests discomfort, suggests that at least some Spartans recognized the contradictions, understood that their egalitarianism rested on foundations that could not withstand scrutiny. But recognizing contradiction and being able to resolve it were different things. To abolish helot slavery would be to abolish Sparta itself, to end the system that defined Spartan identity, to become just another Greek city. The equals who were unequal testify to the difficulty of creating genuine equality, to the tendency of egalitarian systems to develop new hierarchies, to the way that proclaimed equality can mask real inequalities. Sparta's attempt was more serious than most societies, went further toward actual equality among citizens than most Greek cities achieved. But the attempt was also fatally flawed. The equality was exclusive rather than inclusive, was maintained through external oppression rather than through internal distribution, created rigid system that could not adapt when circumstances changed. The system worked for a time, perhaps 2 or 3 centuries, but eventually failed because demographic attrition and economic pressures created inequalities the system had no mechanisms to address. We close contemplating Sparta's egalitarian ideal and its unequal reality. The vision of citizens as equals, sharing common meals and common hardships, owing allegiance to community rather than pursuing individual wealth, this vision has inspired political movements across history, from ancient reformers to modern socialists. But Sparta also demonstrates the dangers, that egalitarianism can justify oppression of outsiders, that rigid equality can become tyranny enforcing conformity, that systems designed to prevent inequality can themselves become new forms of hierarchy. The equals who were unequal, the egalitarian rhetoric masking oppressive reality, the ideal that inspired and the implementation that failed. A forever teaching that equality is difficult, that good intentions are insufficient, that systems must be judged by their full reality rather than by their proclaimed ideals. Sparta's decline was visible by the early 4th century BCE, became undeniable after the catastrophic defeat at Leuctra in 371 BCE, continued through gradual irrelevance until Sparta became Roman client state and eventually tourist attraction, where Romans came to watch traditional Spartan practices that were probably reconstructions rather than authentic continuities. The fall was not sudden collapse but slow erosion, not single catastrophe but accumulation of factors that Sparta's rigid system could not address. The population of Spartiates was shrinking from perhaps 8,000 adult male citizens in 5th century to perhaps 1,500 by mid-4th century to fewer than 1,000 by Hellenistic period. The attrition came through battle losses, through economic pressures that made some unable to maintain citizenship, through Spartans choosing not to subject sons to agoge, through demographic failure to replace losses. The economic system was failing. The formal equality of land distribution had broken down. Some Spartans had accumulated wealth while others fell into poverty. The informal mechanisms that had once redistributed wealth, adoptions, strategic marriages, gifts, were no longer functioning effectively. Aristotle, writing in mid-4th century, complained that Spartan women controlled 2/5 of the land, that wealth inequality had increased dramatically, that many Spartans lived in poverty while few lived in luxury. Whether women's land ownership was cause or symptom of Sparta's problems is debatable, but the inequality itself was undeniable. The egalitarian system that had defined Sparta was collapsing into oligarchy where wealthy few controlled impoverished many. The helot system was straining. The constant fear of rebellion, the need to maintain terror through cryptea and annual war declarations, the impossibility of trusting enslaved majority who vastly outnumbered their masters, all this created psychological burden and military vulnerability. Sparta had to keep significant forces at home to prevent helot uprising, could not deploy its full military strength abroad, could not risk major defeat because defeat might trigger rebellion. The system that had enabled Spartan military focus by freeing citizens from agricultural labor had also created permanent weakness, permanent vulnerability, permanent constraint on Spartan power projection. The military system was becoming obsolete. Sparta had perfected hoplite warfare, heavy infantry fighting in phalanx formation with overlapping shields and long spears. For 2 centuries, Spartan hoplites were unmatched. Their discipline and training made them superior to any other heavy infantry in Greece. But warfare was evolving. Lighter troops, cavalry, siege warfare, tactical innovations that exploited weaknesses in traditional phalanx formations. Sparta's military conservatism, its refusal to adapt tactics or to incorporate new military technologies, its conviction that traditional methods were superior, all this made Spartan army increasingly vulnerable to innovation. The crisis came at Leuctra. In 371 BCE, Theban general Epaminondas faced Spartan army under King Cleombrotus. The traditional Greek battle formation placed best troops on the right wing. Each soldier's shield protected his left side and his neighbor's right, making the unshielded right flank vulnerable, so best troops went there to hold against enemies' best troops. Battles typically began with right wings advancing, left wings withdrawing, forming rotating engagement until one side's formation broke. Epaminondas reversed the convention. He concentrated his best troops, the Sacred Band, elite unit of paired lovers who fought with extraordinary courage on his left wing in deep formation, 50 men deep instead of usual 8 or 12. He held his right wing back, creating oblique formation that engaged Spartan right wing with overwhelming force while refusing battle elsewhere. The Spartan right wing, expecting to face weak Theban left, instead encountered massive concentration of Theban strength. The deep Theban column pushed through Spartan line, killed King Cleombrotus, shattered the formation that had been thought unbreakable. 400 Spartans died, catastrophic loss for population already depleted, proportionally equivalent to nation of 5 million, losing perhaps 50,000 soldiers in single battle. The psychological impact exceeded the military one. If Spartans could be defeated in set-piece hoplite battle, if their discipline and training did not guarantee victory, what justified the sacrifices? What justified the brutal agoge, the harsh discipline, the helot oppression, the cultural poverty if all of it failed to produce military invincibility? The defeat led directly to Messenia's liberation. Epaminondas invaded Laconia, freed the Messenian helots, helped them build fortified city of Messene that would prevent Sparta from reconquering them. The loss was devastating. Messenia had been under Spartan control for 3 centuries, had provided roughly half the agricultural base that sustained Spartan citizens, had been integral to Spartan system. Without Messenian helots, without the land and labor they provided, Sparta could not maintain its distinctive system. The warrior class shrank further, the citizen population declined more rapidly, Sparta became minor power virtually overnight. Sparta tried to adapt, tried to recover, tried various reforms and expedients, freed some helots and gave them semi-citizenship to increase military manpower, granted citizenship to some hypomaeans who could pay, allowed Perioik to serve in Spartan armies alongside Spartiates, accepted subsidies from Persia in exchange for abandoning Greek cities in Asia Minor to Persian control, betraying the Greek freedom Sparta had claimed to defend, hired mercenaries when citizen soldiers were insufficient. All these expedients addressed symptoms without solving fundamental problems. That Spartan system was rigid, was demographically unsustainable, was militarily obsolete, was morally compromised. The attempted radical reforms came too late and failed. King Augustus IV in late 3rd century BCE tried to restore Lycurgus system, cancel debts, redistribute land, expand citizenship to include more inhabitants, return to traditional austerity and equality. The reforms threatened wealthy Spartans who had accumulated land and power during the decline. The ephors, representing conservative interests, had agoges arrested and executed, one of only 2 Spartan kings ever executed by Spartan state, revealing how far Sparta had fallen from its proclaimed ideals. King Cleomenes III later succeeded briefly in implementing similar reforms, abolished the ephorate, redistributed land, expanded citizenship. But his reforms were overthrown after military defeat, and Cleomenes fled to Egypt, where he eventually died. By Hellenistic period, Sparta was minor power, interesting primarily as historical curiosity, unusual for maintaining traditions when other Greek cities had evolved. The Romans treated Sparta with mixture of respect for its past and contempt for its present weakness. Some Romans admired Spartan discipline and wanted to emulate it. Others saw Sparta as failed state, example of what happens when society becomes too rigid to adapt. Roman tourists visited Sparta to watch traditional practices, the agoge training, the ritual whippings, the austere meals, but these were likely performances for tourists rather than authentic continuities, were reconstructions of what Sparta was supposed to have been rather than what it actually still was. The final indignity came in 146 BCE when Rome conquered Greece and Sparta became part of Roman province of Achaia. Sparta maintained some local autonomy, continued to govern itself according to traditional forms, but was subordinated to Roman power, had to follow Roman foreign policy, existed at Rome's sufferance. The warrior state that had once dominated Greece, that had defeated Athens in Peloponnesian War, that had terrified enemies through reputation alone, this state now existed as subject to Rome, as minor city in someone else's empire, as tourist attraction trading on former glory. The fall teaches multiple lessons. First, that rigid systems cannot adapt when circumstances change, that conservatism that preserves traditional forms cannot respond to new challenges, that refusal to evolve is death sentence when world around you evolves. Sparta's military system was optimized for 5th century hoplite warfare, could not adapt to tactical innovations of 4th century, became obsolete while Spartans insisted it was eternal. Second, that demographic decline can destroy society regardless of military prowess, that population is power in ways that training and discipline cannot overcome, that society's bleeding citizens are society's dying. Sparta's citizen population declined from perhaps 8,000 to perhaps 1,000 over 2 centuries. No amount of individual warrior excellence could compensate for such attrition. Third, that systems built on oppression contain seeds of their own destruction, that helot slavery created vulnerabilities that enemies eventually exploited, that the oppressed will rebel when opportunity arises. Messenia's liberation after Leuctra was not generous act by Thebes but strategic blow that crippled Sparta permanently, demonstrated that Sparta's dependence on helot labor was fatal weakness. Fourth, that specialization creates vulnerability, that society optimized for single purpose fails when that purpose proves insufficient, that civilizations need multiple sources of strength. Sparta produced warriors and little else when warriors proved inadequate. Sparta had no alternative sources of power to draw upon. we close contemplating what the fall teaches about civilization's fragility. Sparta had been powerful, had dominated Greece for generations, had seemed invincible. Yet it fell not to external conquest initially, but to internal contradictions, not to barbarian invasion, but to demographic decline and system rigidity and tactical obsolescence. The fall was predictable in retrospect. The factors that would eventually destroy Sparta were visible from the beginning, were built into the system's foundations. But Spartans could not see it, could not imagine their system failing, could not conceive of adapting because adaptation meant ceasing to be Sparta. The fall that Sparta could not prevent because preventing it would have required becoming something other than Sparta. The decline that was inevitable once the system's contradictions became unsustainable. The defeat that shattered reputation and revealed that military excellence alone was insufficient. The liberation of Messenia that removed the foundation on which everything rested. The demographic collapse that made recovery impossible. The final irrelevance as Sparta became minor city in someone else's empire, trading on memories of former glory, performing traditions for tourists, existing as historical curiosity rather than as living power. The fall, the decline, the irrelevance. A forever teaching that no system is eternal, that rigidity leads to brittleness, that specialization creates vulnerability, that oppression contains its own defeat, that military power without demographic strength or cultural richness or moral legitimacy is power that cannot endure. Sparta's fall. The warrior state that could not survive without war, could not adapt to peace, could not imagine alternatives, could not prevent the decline that its own choices made inevitable. Sparta produced warriors but produced almost no philosophy, no drama that survived, no poetry beyond military songs, no art comparable to Athens, no intellectual tradition that shaped Western thought. The absence is striking and deliberate. Athens, Sparta's rival and eventually its defeated enemy, gave us Socrates questioning everything, Plato imagining ideal forms, Aristotle systematizing knowledge, produced tragedies that explored moral complexity and comedies that questioned authority, created philosophical and dramatic traditions that defined Western culture for millennia. Sparta gave us military tactics and cautionary political tales. The contrast reveals choices. Athens chose to value intellectual inquiry alongside military strength. Sparta chose to value military excellence exclusively, subordinated all other human capabilities to martial purpose. The explanation lies in Sparta's values and fears. The system prioritized obedience over questioning, valued action over contemplation, feared that intellectual development might undermine military discipline. Boys in agoge learned to read and write. Spartans were literate, maintained records, could communicate in writing but received no education in philosophy or rhetoric or abstract reasoning. They learned practical skills, military tactics, weapon use, physical conditioning, endurance training. They learned traditional songs and poems, but only those that reinforced Spartan values, that celebrated courage and condemned cowardice, that told stories of Spartan heroes who died gloriously rather than surrender. What they did not learn was how to question. The agoge did not teach critical thinking, did not encourage examination of assumptions, did not develop capacity for abstract reasoning or philosophical speculation. The omissions were deliberate. Spartans recognized that philosophers make poor soldiers because philosophers question orders, examine assumptions, consider alternatives, think about whether commands are justified. Soldiers need to obey immediately, need to follow orders without hesitation, need to act rather than think. The conflict between philosophical inquiry and military obedience shaped Spartan choices. They chose obedience, sacrificed inquiry, created system that produced warriors but could not produce philosophers. The anti-intellectual bias extended beyond military necessity. The Spartans feared innovation, worried that new ideas might destabilize traditional system, suspected that exposure to foreign ideas might make Spartans question whether their way of life was truly superior. The prohibition on foreign travel served multiple purposes, kept Spartans from seeing alternative systems that might inspire doubts, prevented foreign ideas from entering Sparta and contaminating traditional values, maintained isolation that preserved Spartan distinctiveness. The conservatism was extreme. Sparta resisted change in all domains, maintained traditional practices long after other Greeks had evolved, preserved archaic customs that elsewhere had been abandoned centuries earlier. But the intellectual poverty had costs. Sparta produced no political philosophy comparable to Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics, no systematic thinking about governance or justice or social organization. The result was that when Sparta's system began failing in 4th century BCE, Spartans had no intellectual resources for understanding why or for imagining alternatives. They could only try to restore the old system, cancel debts, redistribute land, return to Lycurgan traditions without questioning whether the system itself was flawed, whether its fundamental premises were mistaken, whether restoration was possible or desirable. The absence of drama is particularly revealing. Athenian tragedy explored moral complexity, presented characters facing impossible choices, examined how well-intentioned actions could produce catastrophic results, questioned whether divine justice existed or whether suffering was simply arbitrary. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides wrote plays that have been performed continuously for 2,500 years, that still speak to human condition, that explore questions about fate and freedom and responsibility that remain urgent. Sparta produced no comparable dramatic tradition, created no plays that examined moral ambiguity or questioned authority or explored psychological complexity. The explanation perhaps is that drama requires acknowledging complexity, requires presenting multiple perspectives, requires imagining how situations look from different viewpoints, all skills that threatened Spartan system. The Spartan values were supposed to be clear and unambiguous. Courage is good, cowardice is bad, obedience is essential, retreat is shameful. Drama that explored nuance, that asked whether courage might sometimes be foolishness, whether obedience might sometimes be complicity, whether retreat might sometimes be wisdom, would undermine the clear moral system that Spartan military discipline required. So Sparta produced no drama, maintained moral clarity by refusing to examine it, preserved traditional values by forbidding inquiry into whether those values were adequate. The absence of art beyond functional military items reveals similar priorities. Athens produced sculpture that still amazes the Parthenon marbles, the statues of gods and heroes and athletes that captured human form with unmatched skill, the pottery decorated with scenes from mythology and daily life. Sparta produced little comparable art. What sculpture existed served military or religious purposes, was functional rather than aesthetic, valued representation of power over beauty. The austerity extended to architecture. Spartan buildings were deliberately plain, lacking the decoration and ornament that characterized architecture elsewhere, proclaiming through simplicity that Spartans valued function over form, substance over appearance. But art serves purposes beyond decoration. Art expresses values, explores possibilities, imagines alternatives to current reality, develops human capacity for seeing differently. Societies without robust artistic traditions are societies with diminished imaginative capacity, with reduced ability to conceive of alternatives, with stunted human development in domains that make life worth living beyond mere survival. Sparta's artistic poverty reflected and reinforced its intellectual poverty, both testified to society that had chosen narrow focus over broad development, that had sacrificed human flourishing to military excellence, that had impoverished its citizens' lives to maintain their fighting effectiveness. The silence where philosophy should have been speaks loudly. What ideas might Spartans have developed if they had valued intellectual inquiry as Athens did? What philosophical traditions might have emerged from society with such different values and structure? We can speculate, perhaps philosophy of duty and honor, perhaps exploration of collective versus individual, perhaps examination of what military virtue means and requires, perhaps systematic thinking about education and its purposes. But we cannot know because Sparta forbade the inquiry, feared the questions, maintained intellectual silence that complemented its military discipline. The cost becomes visible in comparison with Athens. Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, was besieged, starved, forced to surrender, saw its walls torn down and its empire taken. But Athens won the cultural competition. Its ideas and art and philosophy spread across Mediterranean world, shaped Hellenistic civilization, influenced Rome, defined Western tradition. Sparta won the war but lost everything else. Its military dominance lasted single generation after defeating Athens, but its cultural influence was negligible, its intellectual contributions were minimal, its legacy is primarily negative, example of what to avoid rather than model to emulate. Perhaps the silence itself is the message. Perhaps Sparta's failure to produce philosophy or drama or art testifies more powerfully than any achievement could. It testifies that military excellence alone is insufficient, that society focused exclusively on warfare impoverishes itself in all other domains, that humans need more than discipline and courage to flourish, that civilization requires intellectual inquiry and artistic expression, and the freedom to question and imagine. The silence where philosophy should have been is not empty silence, is loud testimony to what happens when society chooses too narrowly, when it values one human capability while neglecting all others. We close in that silence, feeling its weight, understanding its meaning. The philosophy that was never written, the plays that were never performed, the art that was never created all testify to Sparta's fatal narrowness, to the choice to produce warriors at the cost of producing nothing else. The silence where philosophy should have been is Sparta's most eloquent statement, proof that military excellence without intellectual development is achievement purchased at catastrophic cost, that warriors without philosophers are soldiers without wisdom, that society without robust intellectual tradition is society that cannot understand itself or imagine alternatives or adapt when adaptation is necessary. The silence, the absence. The choice to value obedience over inquiry, action over thought, military discipline over intellectual freedom, forever testifying to what was lost when Sparta chose the warrior's path exclusively, forever demonstrating that what society refuses to create is as revealing as what it does create. A forever standing as warning that silence in place of philosophy, absence where art should flourish, emptiness where drama should explore complexity, these silences speak volumes about civilization's limitations, about the cost of choosing too narrowly, about the poverty that follows from pursuing single excellence while neglecting all others. Sparta fell as power but survived as legend. The image of the Spartan warrior disciplined beyond measure, courageous unto death, willing to hold Thermopylae against impossible odds, trained from childhood to value honor over life, this image transcended Sparta's historical reality, became symbol of martial excellence that has inspired military traditions across 2 millennia. Roman soldiers admired Spartan virtues, read Plutarch's account of Lycurgus and Spartan customs, tried to emulate Spartan discipline in Roman legions. Medieval knights invoked Spartan comparisons, saw in 300 at Thermopylae model of knightly courage and sacrifice. Renaissance humanists studied Sparta as political example, debated whether its egalitarianism or its militarism was more significant. Modern militaries reference Spartan traditions. Elite units train with deliberate harshness reminiscent of agoge. Military academies cultivate Spartan values of discipline and sacrifice. Special forces units adopt Spartan symbols and rhetoric. The legend is powerful because it simplifies, emphasizes courage and discipline while downplaying the helot slavery that made Spartan system possible. Emphasizes Thermopylae while ignoring that Spartan inflexibility contributed to defeats elsewhere. It emphasizes equality among Spartiates while ignoring massive inequality below them. Emphasizes military excellence while ignoring cultural poverty. The legend extracts what seems admirable: the courage, the discipline, the willingness to sacrifice, while discarding the context that complicates simple admiration. The result is Spartan image that can inspire without troubling, that can motivate without raising difficult questions about costs and contradictions. This chapter examines how legends form, how they persist, how they shape subsequent history in ways that exceed the original historical reality. Sparta the legend is more influential than Sparta the reality has inspired more actions, shaped more institutions, influenced more societies than the actual ancient city-state ever did. The power of narrative, the appeal of simple stories of heroism, the human desire for exemplars of courage and sacrifice, all these ensure that legendary Sparta will endure long after scholarly understanding of historical Sparta has complicated or undermined the simple legend. But legends can be dangerous. The Spartan legend has been invoked by movements and regimes that used it to justify brutality, oppression, militarism. Nazi Germany admired Sparta, saw in its eugenic practices and its militarism model for Aryan state, invoked Spartan precedent to justify eliminating inferior peoples and building totalitarian military society. The comparison was not accidental. The Nazis recognized kinship between their ideology and Spartan values, saw in Sparta proof that harsh discipline and racial purity and military focus could create superior society. The fact that Sparta eventually failed, that its system proved unsustainable, that its narrowness destroyed it, these complications did not fit Nazi narrative, so they were ignored. Fascist Italy similarly invoked Sparta. Mussolini praised Spartan discipline and military values, tried to create modern society based on ancient warrior ideals. Military dictatorships across history have referenced Sparta to justify authoritarian rule, argued that democracy is weakness and that strong military government embodying Spartan values is necessary for national survival. The pattern reveals the danger. Spartan legend provides vocabulary and examples for those who want to justify military rule, to subordinate individuals to state, to value order over freedom, to enforce discipline through harshness, to eliminate those deemed weak or inferior. But the legend has also inspired resistance. The Thermopylae story has been invoked by defenders facing overwhelming odds, by Greeks fighting for independence in 1820s, by soldiers in world wars holding desperate positions, by anyone facing situation where retreat seems rational but stand seems honorable. The legend provides narrative template. Small force of brave warriors holding against enemy horde, buying time with their lives, achieving immortality through sacrifice. The template has real power. Soldiers facing death can draw courage from knowing their stand will be remembered, can find meaning in sacrifice by connecting their actions to ancient precedent. Military training across cultures has been influenced by Spartan model. The deliberate harshness, the emphasis on unit cohesion over individual comfort, the building of pain tolerance through controlled suffering, the creation of warriors who will not yield, all these derive partly from Spartan precedent, from understanding that agoge system successfully created disciplined soldiers. Modern military training is less extreme than agoge, doesn't take children at age 7, doesn't deliberately starve trainees, doesn't include Cryptea's murder of civilians as training exercise, but it borrows principles. That hardship builds character, that suffering shared creates bonds, that discipline must be instilled through rigorous training, that soldiers must learn to obey immediately without questioning. The danger is in degree. Where does appropriate military discipline end and abuse begin? Where does building toughness become building trauma? Where does creating unit cohesion become destroying individual identity? The Spartan model, taken literally, crosses all these lines, is systematically traumatic, deliberately dehumanizing, consciously designed to break individuals and remake them as instruments for states' use. Modern militaries that invoke Spartan precedent must navigate carefully, wanting the discipline and courage without the abusiveness, wanting the unit cohesion without the loss of humanity, wanting the martial effectiveness without the cultural poverty. The legend's appeal is understandable. Humans admire courage, respect discipline, honor sacrifice. The Spartans at Thermopylae embodied these virtues in extreme form, became ultimate example of martial excellence. The 300 story is genuinely inspiring. Their courage was real, their sacrifice was meaningful, their stand had strategic and psychological consequences that shaped history. Honoring their courage is appropriate, learning from their example is reasonable, drawing inspiration from their willingness to face death for larger cause is understandable. But the legend becomes dangerous when it's invoked to justify system that created such warriors. The courage of the 300 doesn't justify the agoge that traumatized boys to create them. The discipline they showed doesn't justify the helot slavery that supported Spartan system. The sacrifice they made doesn't justify the rigid inflexibility that prevented Sparta from adapting. We can honor the warriors while questioning the system, can admire the courage while criticizing the society, can learn from the example while rejecting the model. The legend's persistence reveals something about human psychology. We want heroes, want clear examples of virtue, want stories that inspire without complicating. Spartan legend provides these, gives us warriors who were unambiguously courageous, who made clear choice to die rather than retreat, who embodied values we admire. The fact that historical reality was more complicated, that Spartan warriors were products of traumatic conditioning, that their inability to retreat might reflect lack of alternatives rather than free choice, that system producing such warriors was deeply flawed. These complications don't negate the courage, but do require acknowledging that simple inspiration is insufficient response to complex reality. We close contemplating legend's power and its dangers. The Spartan image has shaped how we think about courage and sacrifice, has influenced military traditions across millennia, has inspired both resistance to tyranny and justification for authoritarianism. The legend is neither simply good nor simply bad, is tool that can be used for various purposes, is narrative that can inspire various actions, is symbol whose meaning changes depending on who invokes it and why. The challenge is learning from legend without worshipping it, drawing inspiration while maintaining critical perspective, honoring what deserves honor while rejecting what deserves rejection. The legend that outlived the city testifies to story's power over reality, to narrative's persistence beyond facts, to human need for exemplars, even when exemplars are more complicated than legends acknowledge. Sparta, the legend, will persist regardless of what historians discover about Sparta, the reality. The 300 will continue inspiring soldiers and citizens, will continue providing template for courage and sacrifice, will continue shaping how humans think about duty and honor and martial virtue. The question is whether we can learn from legend while avoiding its dangers, can be inspired by courage while questioning the system that produced it, can honor sacrifice while refusing to glorify the traumatic training that made sacrifice possible. The legend, the symbol, the inspiration and the warning. A forever outliving the city that created it. Forever shaping history through narrative power. Forever teaching that what we remember is as important as what actually happened, that stories shape reality even when stories simplify reality, that legends persist because humans need them, but that responsibility comes with the need, the responsibility to remember complexity alongside inspiration, to acknowledge costs alongside achievements, to learn full lessons rather than simple ones. Sparta serves as mirror for every civilization that follows, shows what happens when society prioritizes military strength absolutely, when individual is subordinated completely to state, when questioning is forbidden and obedience is ultimate virtue, when efficiency is valued over humanity, when single goal becomes all-consuming obsession. The mirror is uncomfortable because it reflects possibilities we recognize in ourselves. The temptation to sacrifice freedom for security, to embrace authoritarianism when democracy seems messy and inefficient, to value order over justice when disorder threatens, to accept brutality when it produces desired results, to subordinate individuals to collective when collective interests seem pressing. Every militaristic society since Sparta has been compared to Sparta. The comparison is simultaneously compliment and warning, acknowledgement of effectiveness alongside caution about costs. When observers want to critique excessive militarism, they invoke Sparta as cautionary example. When military leaders want to justify harsh discipline, they invoke Sparta as successful model. The dual use reveals the mirror's ambiguity. What we see in Sparta depends on what we're looking for, on whether we emphasize achievements or costs, on whether we focus on Thermopylae or on the agoge, on whether we highlight courage or cruelty. This chapter asks what we see when we look in Spartan mirror. Do we admire their discipline or fear it? Do we envy their focus or pity their narrowness? Do we celebrate their courage or mourn their lost humanity? The answers reveal our values, reveal what we fear, reveal who we are and who we might become if we're not careful. The mirror shows both inspiration and warning, shows what dedicated discipline can achieve and what it costs, shows the heights humans can reach through focused effort and the depths they fall into when focus becomes obsession. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about limits and balance. Sparta demonstrates what happens when society focuses too narrowly, when one value, military excellence, is elevated above all others, when all other human capabilities are sacrificed to single goal. The achievement was real. Sparta produced the finest heavy infantry in Greece, created warriors who held Thermopylae, built military machine that dominated Peloponnese for generations. But the cost was equally real: cultural poverty, intellectual sterility, moral corruption through helot slavery, demographic decline, psychological damage to citizens subjected to agoge, eventual collapse when rigid system could not adapt to changed circumstances. The lesson applies beyond military domain. Any society that focuses too narrowly whether on military strength, economic growth, technological development, ideological purity, religious orthodoxy risks Sparta's fate. Achievement in chosen domain purchased through atrophy in all others, excellence of one kind creating poverty of all other kinds, success by narrow definition leading to failure by broader measure. Human societies require balance, require attending to multiple values and capabilities, require maintaining flexibility and diversity of strengths. Sparta's failure teaches that single-minded pursuit of single goal is path to comprehensive failure even when goal is achieved. The mirror also reflects questions about freedom and security, about individual and collective, about the trade-offs societies make or should make. Sparta subordinated individual completely to collective, sacrificed personal freedom to group cohesion, maintained security through regimentation and control. The result was stable society, at least among citizen class, with clear rules and shared values and strong sense of collective identity. But the result was also oppressive society where individual creativity was suppressed, where questioning was punished, where conformity was mandatory, where humans could not develop their full potential because full potential threatened systems' requirements. Modern societies face similar tensions: how much individual freedom should be sacrificed for collective security, how much diversity should be tolerated when diversity creates disorder, how much questioning should be allowed when questioning undermines authority. Sparta suggests that complete subordination of individual to collective, complete sacrifice of freedom to security, complete prohibition of questioning in service of order, these choices produce stability at cost of humanity, produce cohesion through oppression, produce security that is itself form of imprisonment. The mirror shows authoritarian temptation that every society faces. When democracy seems chaotic, when freedom produces disorder, when questioning creates instability, when diversity generates conflict, the temptation arises to impose order from above, to demand obedience, to suppress dissent, to create system like Sparta where everyone knows their place and fulfills their assigned role and questions nothing. The temptation is understandable. Ordered society is attractive, disciplined population is efficient, clear hierarchy eliminates confusion. But Sparta reminds us that order without freedom is tyranny, that efficiency without humanity is mechanization, that stability without flexibility is brittleness. Every dystopian novel, every totalitarian regime, every argument for sacrificing liberty to security invokes something Spartan: the perfectly ordered society where individuals exist only to serve collective, where questioning is treason and obedience is highest virtue, where systems' perpetuation matters more than individuals' flourishing. The Spartan mirror shows this future, shows what happens when such visions are implemented, shows the achievements they enable and the costs they exact, shows that perfect order is purchased through perfect control, that absolute security requires absolute surrender of freedom. But the mirror also shows possibilities for resistance. If Sparta exemplifies the authoritarian temptation, Athens exemplifies the democratic alternative. Messy, chaotic, contentious, but also creative, innovative, free. The contrast between Sparta and Athens, between order and freedom, between discipline and creativity, between stability and innovation remains central to political thought. Societies must navigate between extremes. Too much order becomes tyranny, too much freedom becomes anarchy, too much stability becomes stagnation, too much change becomes chaos. Sparta and Athens represent the poles, and the lesson is that neither extreme is sustainable, that human societies need elements of both order and freedom, both discipline and creativity, both stability and innovation. The mirror Sparta holds reflects questions about military force and its proper role. Sparta elevated military strength to highest value, subordinated everything else to martial excellence, created society where being warrior was not just one role among many but was the only role that truly mattered. The result was temporary military dominance but also permanent militarization, permanent preparation for war, permanent readiness for violence that made peace impossible even when actual warfare was absent. The lesson is that societies organized primarily for war cannot create or sustain peace, that military force is a tool that should serve larger purposes rather than being purpose itself, that warriors must be subordinate to civilian authority rather than constituting society's highest authority. The question echoes through modern debates: what role should military play in society? How much should be spent on defense? Should military values influence civilian culture? Should martial virtues be held up as models for civilians? Sparta suggests that making military supreme, that letting military values dominate civilian culture, that allowing warrior ethos to shape society comprehensively, these choices lead to permanent militarization, to society that can wage war brilliantly but cannot create anything else, that can destroy enemies but cannot build lasting peace, that can train warriors but cannot produce the philosophers and artists and citizens that flourishing civilization requires. We close turning from the mirror, acknowledging what we've learned but refusing the path Sparta took. The mirror shows what we might become if we're not careful, if we sacrifice too much freedom to security, if we subordinate individuals completely to collective, if we let single value dominate all others, if we build society for war rather than society that maintains military capability as one tool among many for protecting and advancing other values. The mirror warns, this is what happens when you choose as Sparta chose, when you focus as Sparta focused, when you sacrifice as Sparta sacrificed. But we need not follow that path, can honor courage while rejecting brutal training that created it, can value discipline while protecting freedom, can maintain security while preserving liberty, can create effective military while subordinating it to civilian authority, can learn from Sparta's achievements without repeating its mistakes. I can look in the mirror, see what we fear becoming, and choose differently. Can acknowledge the Spartan temptation toward order, discipline, clarity, strength, while remembering what that temptation costs when followed to its conclusion. The mirror, the warning, the example of what to avoid, the lesson written in ruins and legends, and the silence where culture should have flourished. A forever showing what happens when single value becomes obsessive focus, when military excellence becomes civilization's only goal, when humans are reduced to instruments for states' use, when society loses sight of what makes human life worth living beyond mere survival and dominance. The mirror that shows what we fear becoming, the warning we must heed, the path we must refuse to follow. Throughout its existence, Sparta lived in permanent state of military readiness, warriors living in barracks until age 30, training continuously even in peacetime, prepared for war that might come tomorrow or next decade or never. The readiness shaped everything, the harsh agoge that trained warriors from childhood, the brutal crypteia that terrorized helots to prevent rebellion, the rigid discipline that allowed no softness lest warriors weaken in ways that might prove fatal if war came. The system created warriors capable of extraordinary military performance demonstrated at Thermopylae and countless other battles, but incapable of living at peace, incapable of finding the breath between war and peace where most human life actually occurs. The contrast with Athens reveals what Sparta lost. Athens produced philosophy and drama during same period it fought wars, created Parthenon while maintaining navy, supported poets and philosophers while fielding armies. Athenian citizens fought in military. Athens was not pacifist, but military service was one role among many, was not the totality of identity, was not the only thing that mattered. Athenian could be soldier and citizen and philosopher, could serve in campaigns and return to civilian life, could fulfill military obligations while also participating in democracy and attending theater and engaging in commerce and philosophy. Spartans could not. The agoge from age 7 to 20, the barracks life from 20 to 30, the continuous military training even after 30, these created warriors who had no other identity, who knew only military life, who had been shaped since childhood to be soldiers and nothing else. When Spartans returned from campaigns, they returned not to homes and families but to barracks and training grounds, maintained military discipline even when no immediate threat existed, lived as if war were permanent condition even during periods of peace. The psychological cost was immense. Humans cannot live in permanent emergency without damage, cannot maintain warrior mentality indefinitely without losing other aspects of humanity, cannot prepare constantly for conflict without becoming unable to rest when conflict ends. Modern understanding of combat stress, of PTSD, of psychological effects of continuous military readiness, all this helps us understand what Spartan system did to its citizens. The agoge created trauma. The continuous military life maintained that trauma, the inability to ever truly relax or be vulnerable or live at peace perpetuated psychological damage across entire lifetimes. The permanent militarization also prevented Sparta from developing capabilities needed for peacetime. Diplomatic skill, commercial acumen, cultural production, philosophical inquiry, all these require different mindsets than warfare require abilities to negotiate and compromise and create and question that military discipline suppresses. Sparta's permanent military readiness made Spartans effective warriors but incompetent peacetime leaders. When Sparta defeated Athens and became hegemon of Greece, Spartan rule was disastrous. Harsh, inflexible, unable to govern the complex alliance system that Athens had managed, unable to maintain peace precisely because Spartans knew only war. The lesson resonates beyond ancient history. Modern militaries face similar challenges: how to train soldiers for warfare's intensity without making them incapable of peacetime life. How to maintain readiness without creating permanent state of emergency. How to instill discipline necessary for combat effectiveness without traumatizing soldiers or preventing them from transitioning back to civilian life. The balance is difficult, perhaps impossible to achieve perfectly, but Sparta demonstrates the cost of not even attempting it, the cost of creating society where military readiness is permanent condition, where peace is merely absence of current conflict rather than positive state with its own requirements and possibilities. The breadth between war and peace is essential for human flourishing. War requires intensity, focus, willingness to kill and risk death, subordination of self to unit, obedience to authority. Peace requires different things: creativity, questioning, individuality, vulnerability, trust, cooperation without coercion. Humans need capability for extraordinary action when circumstances demand it, need also capability for ordinary life, for love and art and philosophy and the daily activities that make life worth defending. Sparta created capacity for extraordinary action but destroyed capacity for ordinary life, produced warriors who could face impossible odds but could not enjoy peace, could not rest, could not be vulnerable or tender or creative or questioning. The permanent preparation also prevented questioning whether warfare itself was necessary. Societies at peace can question whether conflicts are worth fighting, can seek diplomatic solutions, can imagine alternatives to military force. Societies in permanent military readiness tend to see force as solution to problems, tend to respond to challenges with military action, tend to perpetuate cycle of conflict because they are optimized for conflict and have no alternative responses. Sparta's permanent militarization made it default to military solutions, made diplomatic flexibility difficult, made peace hard to achieve even when peace would have served Spartan interests better than continued warfare. The inability to find breadth between war and peace also affected Spartan relationships. Spartans formed deep bonds with their fellow warriors, the bonds forged in combat and maintained through continuous training and barracks life. But these bonds, however deep, were limited to military context, were relationships between warriors rather than relationships between complete humans. The suppression of vulnerability, the prohibition on tenderness, the requirement of constant stoicism, all these prevented Spartans from forming the intimate relationships that make life rich, from being fully known by others, from experiencing the full range of human connection. The famous Spartan marriages reflect this limitation. The Spartans married but lived separately, men in barracks, women in their own quarters. The relationships were primarily reproductive, served states' need for new warriors, did not involve the daily intimacy and shared life that marriage in other Greek cities involved. Some Spartans may have achieved real intimacy with their wives, but the system made it difficult. How to be vulnerable when you've been trained since age 7 to never show weakness, how to be tender when you've been conditioned to be hard, how to love fully when you've been taught that emotional attachment is weakness that might compromise military effectiveness. The question applies broadly. How do societies maintain military capability without becoming militarized? How do they train warriors without creating people who can only be warriors? How do they prepare for war without making war permanent psychological state? The answers require finding balance Sparta never found, require maintaining the breadth between extremes, require recognizing that humans need capability for intensity alongside capability for rest, that extraordinary action must be exceptional rather than constant, that military readiness is means for protecting peace rather than end in itself. We close seeking that breadth, that space between war and peace that Sparta never found. Acknowledging that strength matters, that discipline has value, that capability for collective action in crisis is essential, but acknowledging equally that these cannot be permanent states, that humans need rest and peace and vulnerability and creativity alongside strength and discipline and unity. That society optimized for war cannot create or sustain peace. That warriors who cannot rest, cannot be tender, cannot question these warriors are not fully human, have sacrificed too much of what makes life worth living in service of being able to fight. The breadth between war and peace, the space where most of life occurs, the ordinary days that extraordinary actions exist to protect, the peace that is not merely absence of war but positive state requiring its own capabilities and values. Sparta never found this breadth, never inhabited this space, never developed capability for peace. The failure is deeper than military defeats, is failure to be fully human, to experience fullness of life, to find meaning beyond combat. The breath that must exist for life to be worth living. The space between extremes where humans can flourish. The balance that Sparta sought in military training but never sought in life itself. In modern Sparta, small Greek town built near ancient site, home to perhaps 13,000 people living ordinary lives beneath the shadow of extraordinary past, tourists walk among scattered ruins, red plaques explaining what stood here. Try to imagine warriors who trained and fought and died to maintain system that valued them only as soldiers. The archaeological remains are sparse compared to Athens or Delphi or Olympia, few standing structures. No intact temple or theater, minimal art or architecture. Testament to civilization that built for war rather than for eternity. that invested resources in training warriors rather than constructing monuments, that left little physical legacy because it prioritized temporary military dominance over permanent cultural achievement. The modern town maintains connection to ancient heritage through various means. Includes statue of Leonidas in full warrior gear standing alert, museum displaying artifacts from ancient Sparta weapons, pottery, inscriptions, the few pieces of art that survived references to warrior tradition in civic identity and local culture. But the connection is tourism and nostalgia rather than living continuity, is acknowledgement that whatever Sparta was, it is no more and cannot be recovered, that ancient system died and cannot be resurrected, that modern life has moved beyond what Sparta represented. This final chapter contemplates what remains after civilization falls, what survives when cities crumble, what lessons persist across millennia. We stand at dawn watching light illuminate the valley where Sparta stood, valley now quiet, now ordinary, now home to farmers and shopkeepers and schoolchildren rather than to warriors and helots, and the constant tension of system built on violence. The ruins testify to what was built, the silences testify to what was not built. The legends testify to narrative power that outlasts reality. The modern town testifies to life's continuity beyond any particular civilization's rise and fall. What remains of Sparta? Physically, very little. Scattered foundation stones, broken walls, fragments of columns, excavated areas revealing ancient street patterns and building foundations. The archaeological record is thin because Spartans built simply, because their architecture was deliberately austere, because they invested resources in perishable things, training, discipline, military readiness, rather than in monuments designed for permanence. The contrast with Athens or Rome or Egypt is stark. Those civilizations built grandly, left structures that amaze still, invested in permanence because they valued leaving testimony for future generations. Sparta invested differently, valued different things, left smaller physical trace. Intellectually, also very little remains directly from Sparta itself. No Spartan philosophy survived, no Spartan plays or poems or histories written by Spartans themselves. What we know of Sparta comes almost entirely from non-Spartans. Herodotus and Thucydides observing from outside, Xenophon who admired Sparta but was Athenian, Plutarch writing 6 centuries after Sparta's peak drawing on sources now lost, later writers reporting third-hand accounts and legends. The Spartan voice itself is silent. We hear about Spartans but rarely hear Spartans themselves. We see them through others' eyes but cannot see through Spartan eyes. We know what others thought of Sparta but struggle to know what Spartans thought of themselves. The intellectual silence reflects the choices. Sparta that forbade questioning, that suppressed philosophy, that valued obedience over inquiry, this Sparta naturally left no intellectual legacy. Cannot leave what you never created. It cannot preserve what you actively prevented from existing. The silence is Sparta's statement that military excellence was all that mattered, that cultural production was dispensable, that philosophy and drama and art were luxuries or dangers that warrior society could not afford. The statement is clear, but the silence is louder. Absence of Spartan voice across centuries testifies more powerfully than presence could. What does remain? The legend most prominently. Sparta the symbol, Sparta the inspiration, Sparta the warning. These exist more vividly than Sparta the historical reality. The 300 at Thermopylae, the austere discipline, the egalitarianism among citizens, the unique place in Greek and Western tradition, all these continue shaping how people think about courage and sacrifice, discipline and freedom, military excellence and civic virtue. The legend has power independent of historical accuracy, continues inspiring and warning regardless of scholarly debates about what Sparta actually was versus what people believe it was. The legend's persistence reveals something about human psychology and about how history works. What people believe about the past shapes present and future more than what actually happened shapes them. Sparta that inspires modern warriors, Sparta that warns against militarization, Sparta that symbolizes discipline or oppression depending on speaker's politics. This legendary Sparta affects history more than actual ancient city did. The power of narrative over fact, of symbol over reality, of legend over history, all demonstrated by Sparta's continuing presence in cultural imagination long after cities' physical and political disappearance. The lessons remain as well, available for those willing to learn. Lessons about specialization's dangers, about system rigidity's costs, about demographic decline's importance, about oppression's ultimate failure. Lessons about balance between order and freedom, between individual and collective, between military strength and cultural richness. Lessons about what happens when society chooses too narrowly, when single value becomes all-consuming, when humans are reduced to instruments for states' use. The lessons are not simple, are not Sparta was good or Sparta was bad, are complex recognitions that Sparta achieved much and lost more, that its successes were real but its failures were catastrophic, that it demonstrated both human capability and human limitation. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about trade-offs and choices. Every society faces choices about what to value, what to prioritize, what to sacrifice for other goals. Sparta made particular choices: military excellence over cultural production, collective cohesion over individual freedom, discipline over creativity, order over innovation, tradition over adaptation. The choices created specific results: military dominance for period, but cultural poverty and demographic decline and eventual defeat. The lesson is not that Sparta's specific choices were wrong. Absolutely, military excellence has value, discipline serves purposes, tradition provides stability, but that extreme choices in any direction create extreme results. That balance is necessary for sustainability, that societies need multiple sources of strength rather than excelling in single domain while failing in all others. The dawn breaks over Sparta's ruins, and we see both achievement and failure, both glory and tragedy, both what deserves honoring and what deserves rejecting. The warriors who held Thermopylae deserve honor. Their courage was real, their sacrifice mattered, their example inspires justly. But the system that created them deserves rejection. Its brutality was unnecessary, its oppression was wrong, its narrowness was fatal. We can honor the warriors while condemning the system, can admire the courage while criticizing the society, can learn from both achievement and failure. The modern town built near ancient site represents life's continuity beyond any particular civilization. The people living there are not trying to resurrect Sparta, are not attempting to recreate ancient system, are simply living ordinary lives in place that once was extraordinary. The continuity is reassuring. Civilizations rise and fall, but human life continues. Societies that seem permanent prove temporary, but humanity persists. The particular forms of organization that seem essential prove contingent, but people endure and adapt and create new forms. We walk away from ruins carrying lessons. That balance matters, that humans need more than discipline or military strength, that societies must enable full human flourishing rather than narrow excellence, that freedom and creativity and questioning are essential, not dispensable, that military capability should serve larger purposes rather than being ultimate purpose, that civilizations are judged not by their military victories but by their full contributions to human possibility, that what we build must be worth building, that how we live matters more than how we fight. The dawn over Sparta's ruins illuminates both what was and what is, both the past that cannot return and the present that continues, both the ancient civilization that failed and the modern life that persists in same landscape. The light spreads across valley, touches scattered stones and modern buildings equally, makes no distinction between ancient and modern, treats all equally as part of continuous human story of building and dwelling and eventually leaving, of creating civilizations that seem permanent but prove temporary, of attempting to impose order on time and discovering that time cares nothing for our monuments or our ambitions. Sparta the warning, Sparta the lesson. Sparta the ruins where dawn breaks, illuminating both achievement and limitation, both what was built and what was lost, both the phantom lawgiver's vision and its catastrophic implementation. The warriors who knew how to die but never learned how to live. The society that achieved military excellence while failing comprehensively to create conditions for human flourishing. The city that made choices we must learn from, learn both what to emulate and what to avoid, what to honor and what to reject, what worked and what failed catastrophically. The dawn breaks, the light spreads. And in the ruins and the silence and the continuing life of modern town, the lesson persists. That we must build better than Sparta built, must choose more wisely than Sparta chose, must learn from their example both what to do and what never to do, must create societies that enable full human possibility rather than narrow excellence, must remember that we are more than warriors or workers or any single role, that life must be worth living, not just worth defending, that civilization succeeds not by lasting longest or conquering most, but by enabling humans to flourish fully. The dawn over Sparta's ruins, the ancient past and the continuing present, the lesson written in stones and silences, forever teaching, forever warning. A forever asking whether we can learn, whether we can choose better, whether we can create what Sparta failed to create, societies that balance strength with gentleness, discipline with freedom, collective purpose with individual flourishing, military capability with cultural richness, the extraordinary actions that crisis demands with the ordinary life that makes crisis worth facing. Sparta, the phantom lawgiver, the warrior city. The system that succeeded and failed, that achieved and destroyed, that created Thermopylae and created the Crypteia, that demonstrated human capability and human cruelty in equal measure. Forever in ruins, forever in legend, forever teaching those willing to learn from both its achievements and its catastrophic failures. The dawn breaks, we turn from ruins, we carry lessons forward. And Sparta, ancient, fallen, preserved in fragments and legends, continues teaching, continues warning, continues asking what we will build, how we will choose, whether we can learn from past's mistakes or whether we are doomed to repeat them. The end and the continuing, forever both, forever teaching. Forever the phantom city that exists now more in imagination than in stone, more in warning than in model, more in questions it raises than in answers it provides. Good night, rest now. And remember Sparta, not to worship it but to learn from it, not to repeat it but to surpass it, not to recreate its narrowness but to create the balance it never found, the fullness it never achieved, the humanity it sacrificed in pursuit of inhuman excellence. Sleep. The ancient warriors rest in ruins, their lessons endure, their warnings persist, learn from them, choose better, build wiser, live fuller. Sparta, forever teaching, forever warning. A forever testifying to both human possibility and human limitation, to what we can achieve through discipline and what we lose when discipline becomes tyranny, to the courage we can display and the humanity we can sacrifice, to the glory we can reach and the tragedy we can create. The dawn, the ruins, the lessons, forever.